September 14th, 1984. It was a special night in the history of Congregation Beth Adam. It was the night that we dedicated our Torah. Here at Beth Adam, the Torah is a symbol of our ancestors' search for wisdom and knowledge, and our search for wisdom and knowledge. It's not the foundational truth upon which our Judaism rests. But more, this wasn't and isn't any other Torah. It has a significant and powerful history. Members of Beth Adam and many who have visited our congregation since that day have heard and learned about it. Each time a Barr or Bar mitzvah student reads from this Torah, I tell the congregation that assembles here the story. It deserves repeating tonight. This is known as a Holocaust Torah. You know the history. World War II, the systematic exterminations of Jews. 6 million Jews and 5 million other innocents were murdered by the Nazis in their attempt to create their vision of the world. It was only that the forces of freedom and justice rose up and eventually defeated the Nazis that they were stopped. But they wreaked havoc on Europe and on the world, and it was turned asunder. During their pillage and rape and murder, they decided that they were going to collect the Judaica of the Jewish people, candlesticks and shofars and Torahs and pointers. And they were going to take those pieces of Judaica to Prague. There was already a museum in Prague, the Jewish Museum, and if you have been to Prague, that museum is there. And they were going to take all those pieces of the Jewish people, categorize them, and then they were going to establish what was known as a museum to an extinct ethnological race. They were going to obliterate the Jews. We were going to cease to exist. And then there was going to be this place in Prague that people could come and learn about this bizarre people who were no more. The Nazis were defeated. The Jews of Europe reconstituted their lives, some moving to Israel, some moving to the United States, but many of those congregations and many of those communities never were revived. And the Judaica sat housed in warehouses in Prague. There were Jews in London who had learned about this and knew that there are about 1,600 Torahs, 1,600 Torahs that were in a warehouse. And they came to the Czech government and said, you don't need Torahs, we'll give you Western currency. And those Torahs were brought to the Westminster Synagogue in London. And they made a very important decision, what to do. What to do with 1,600 Torahs. Well, they distributed them on permanent loan to congregations around the world. The idea of permanent loan is very important, that this is our Torah to hold, but we're willing to give it back to the communities if they were ever to regather and ask for them back. It is a horrific facet of one of the darkest periods in Jewish history and darkest in humankind. This is the story I have told for 32 years when the opportunity has presented itself. The problem is, it's not true. It's not true. Or at least one very significant aspect of the story isn't true. The Nazis never planned to build a museum to an extinct ethnological race. I only learned of this recently. I had received an email from the Memorial Scroll Trust in London. They were doing some work on making sure they knew who had the Torahs, and they had a couple questions, and I wrote back and I said, we proudly use our Torah at the high holidays and Barr and Bar mitzvah ceremonies, and I always tell the story about the Torah. And they wrote back, You mentioned that you speak regularly about the memorial scroll Torah number 834. There's a brass tag on our Torah, 834 it says. And you speak about its history. With regard to the story of the Czech Torahs, you may not be aware of the new data resulting from a monograph that was published in 2012 concerning the history of the Jewish Museum in Prague during World War II. Whilst previously we have all referred to the idea of a Nazi plan for a so-called museum to an extinct ethnological race as part of the explanation for the collection of the artifacts in 1942, it now turns out that there is no documentary proof of any such plan. We are therefore asking our scroll holders to remove references to that mythical plan from their telling of the story. I was stunned. For 32 years, I have repeated that story almost verbatim. I read the email several times. I have told that story to literally thousands of people, and it is not true. Recognizing what they had done, they actually put more information on their website to explain what was going on. And they said, although in the past it was said that there was plans by the Nazis to create a so-called museum of an extinct ethnic race in Prague, there is no evidence that this myth is complete. They cite a more accurate understanding of history. It was done by the head of the collections management of the Jewish Museum in Prague. She was an individual who had full access to the entire archives, and she couldn't find any evidence to support the myth of the museum to an extinct ethnological race. And it wasn't until 1960 that she found in any documents a reference to an extinct ethnological race. That's when it seemed to be established. What they also learned was the Jewish communities of Bohemia, Moravia were instructed by the central offices of the Jewish community in Prague to send their artifacts and Torah scrolls to the Jewish Museum in Prague, where they were cataloged and stored. The project to catalog the community artifacts had begun by Jews in the 1930s. The Memorial Scrolls Trust said, "It is our hope that rather than perpetuating a myth demonstrating the evil deeds of Nazis, we can highlight the actions of brave Jews who worked to save what has become the precious legacy for which we care today." They asked that if any of us, any of the rabbis or any of us who are entrusted with these Torahs come across that old story, please let us know so that we can contact those involved and encourage them to correct them. There was no hesitation in what they wrote. There is no evidence that there was such a museum, and the Czech Torahs Society wanted to correct that mistake. This new information challenged me to rethink my understanding of this Torah, how it was collected, how it became part of this collection, and how we received it. It forced me to consider, what do I do with new information? Do I ignore it? If I hadn't told you tonight, I doubt many of you would have ever come across that blog. Do I just stop telling the story? So the next bat mitzvah that's in March or April, I just tell the story a little differently. No one really notices. I just reshape it and go on. Or do I stand up and correct a mistake? For what we do with information, what we do with this information, is more than just about this Torah. It's about how we handle fact from fiction. Rather than dropping the story from my bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah speech, I felt it incumbent to stand up here tonight, this night of all nights, to correct a mistake that I've been propagating for 32 years. It wasn't intentional, but it remains untrue. And I believe it is our responsibility, when we know that something is untrue, that we've spoken about publicly, that we stand up publicly and correct our mistakes. That is our responsibility. I believe we have an obligation to correct our mistakes, intentional or otherwise. That's what we say every year at Yom Kippur, and if we listen to the liturgy, then we should act upon what we say. There's a teaching in Judaism that if you embarrass somebody publicly, a private apology isn't enough. You have to apologize to them in public. Just like you embarrass them in public, you apologize in public. Seems to me that teaching applies to knowledge as well. If I've learned the truth about something I've spoken about incorrectly publicly, then I have a responsibility to speak about it, to correct it publicly as well. It seems to me that this principle, speaking truth when we know it, should apply how we talk about the Jewish experience and how Jewish thought is taught by rabbis and promoted by Jewish organizations. There are many who want to propagate the myths of how Judaism came into being and the supposed miracles that shaped our history, whether it was the Exodus from Egypt or the myth of standing at Sinai or oil that was supposed to last only one day lasting AIDS. Even though scholarship abounds about the origin of the Jewish people and our evolution, that doesn't seem to matter. There seems to be an insistence on repeating myths. In fact, when rabbis try to speak the truth, there are rabbis who have been attacked for speaking the truth, trying to teach history from the pulpit. They have been challenged and called bad because they were trying to not propagate myth, but teach research. It seems that there are people who are more committed in the Jewish community to myths than they are to facts. There's a strange notion among a large segment of rabbis and Jewish leadership that people know the truth rather than the myth, they won't be attracted. This means historically accurate information isn't well known among Jews. We're not the result of some mythic event, singular revelation. We are the evolution and coming together of different tribes that merged over time. This Torah is not a book. It is a collection of stories that have been woven together by different groups at different times. The stories of the fact oftentimes contradict themselves. The rabbis, when they wrote the Torah, they weren't basing it on the text as they read it, or as it was written. They were basing it upon what they wanted it to be, what they wanted it to say. They were reshaping Judaism for their own purposes, propagating their theology, because they were writing and reading with intent. Throughout Jewish history, we've borrowed from the cultures we've lived in. That's part of the Jewish experience. People don't know that there is no one authentic way to be Jewish. And there's still some that pretend that if you live in the past, that makes one more Jewish. Much of what is taught in Judaism is the myth, or as one of my professors used to call it, pediatric Judaism. Jewish teaching designed for children. Stories cute and magical that can hold a child's attention. Yet to build our identity on information that we know not to be true, that is meant for children, leaves all of us on shaky foundation. For me, a Judaism built on myth is sure to crumble. Maybe not tomorrow, but it will, as evidence reveals itself, as research reveals the true origin and evolution of our people. When people push aside evidence for the sake of myth, they are inadvertently saying people aren't to be trusted with truth. That people aren't to be trusted. That's too complicated and too difficult. They won't understand. Frankly, I have more confidence that when people know the truth, they will appreciate the creativity of our ancestors to change and to grow throughout history. This year, we had an ad for a religious school. It read about our religious school where facts are more important than fiction. It wasn't a slogan. It is a fundamental principle of our congregation. Facts here are more important than fiction, not just in the classroom, not just in the library, but in the sanctuary as well. We must always stand up and speak information that we know to be true, and we must correct the myths when they know they are based only on storytelling. The future of the Jewish people needs a solid foundation, not one built on myths and the stories designed for children or for another age. Yom Kippur also calls us to speak about truth in the public and the civic sphere. We need to dispel myths there as well. It seems that in the public arena, particularly in politics, truth and honesty is overshadowed by myth. This needs to change. We all have a stake in this. And please understand, it's not just about this election, and I know this seems to be the extreme. This is just an example of a place and a kind of way where myth is overshadowing fact. We don't need fact checkers in political debates. We need politicians who aren't afraid to tell the truth. Why does it happen? Why do politicians and rabbis avoid truth for the sake of myth? Rabbis and politicians do it for the same reason. Speaking truth is oftentimes more difficult. It means moving beyond sound bites, the political version of pediatric Judaism, to sophisticated and complex conversation. To talk about truth and to talk about research means that you're willing to change your opinion if new information is brought forward. It's trusting. It's trusting that people you talk to can make sound decisions based upon truth rather than preying upon their emotions. Politics and religion often is about power, control, authority. People manipulate myth in an effort to retain their status and their power. Yom Kippur calls us to something higher. And most importantly, the reason I wanted to correct the story about the Torah publicly, because this is Kol Nidrei. It's Kol Nidrei, Yom Kippur. This is what it's all about, telling the truth in our lives, even when it makes us uncomfortable, even if we didn't do it intentionally, even if it means admitting one's error in front of people you care about and you want to be respected by. If we take Yom Kippur seriously, not about coming to services, but about that concept of self-reflection, honest self-reflection, admitting one's mistakes and missteps to oneself, it demands personal honesty. We have to then allow the myth of ourselves to slip from our eyes so we see ourselves as we really are, not as we imagine ourselves to be. It's not an easy task. And when we do, then we go out and where possible, correct what we've done. It requires strength of character. It means being vulnerable. It means taking a risk that what we've done may have left a mark that no apologies can correct. It means that we have to trust the people we are talking to. Yom Kippur asks us to be our better selves who are willing to be honest first with ourselves and then with others. If we want society to be better, if we want politics to be different, if we want Judaism to be different, if we want to be better people, it begins with us tonight on this Yom Kippur. It begins in the privacy of our own thoughts and personal self-reflection. It begins when we turn our gaze inward and genuinely examine the person I am so that I can correct what I've done. It means standing up, and it means admitting our mistakes. It means we say what we mean, and we mean what we say. That's the message of Yom Kippur.